Hello, World Singers. My name is Tyler.
And my name is Brooke.
And this
is Cosmere Conversations.
Hello, all of you wonderful humans out there. We are so excited to get back into our recap and review and look forward on Wind and Truth. We have so many episodes planned ahead, a bunch of exciting things. And remember, we are going in chronological order with all of the new information that we learned in Wind and Truth about the deep past of Roshar, and then are going to be combining that with things we've learned in the past books, bringing us forward to meet our characters that we know and love in the form of Kaladin and Shallan and Dalinar for the actual plot points of Wind and Truth. But we want to give a big special shout out to all of you wonderful world hoppers who have joined us over on Patreon. We've got a Patreon. You can join it. It's fantastic. And Brooke, do you want to tell the people what is coming up available exclusively on the Patreon this month?
Well, I think it was in our last episode, I sort of off the cuff mentioned maybe we should do a drunk history of Roshar. And turns out the people want it.
Exactly.
The people want it. And who are we if not people to give the people what they want?
Yeah, people pleasers. That's what we are.
Yeah, just Cosmere people pleasers. So we will be recording a Drunk History of Roshar episode, which will only be available to our patrons, and it'll be coming out this month. So if you think that would be fun, join us. And or if you just want to say thank you for the work that we do in putting together these episodes, you can also join us, and you're not required to listen to any bonus episodes that you don't want.
Yeah, this upcoming episode is going to be available to anyone, any patron for any amount of time. So $2, that's all it takes to join us over on the lowest tier on Patreon. But let's dive in to the history of Roshar, reminding everyone that we left off last time with the refugees of Ashen, the planet in flames, burning, some type of microkinesis, igniting the atmosphere, leading to a giant seeming L-skate that allowed for the refugees to find the Song of Roshar and step across the barrier. And we have some of our characters visiting the spiritual realm who witness this event with a very special stone from Mr. Hoid, because he is, of course, present at this transition.
Yes, we are going to talk all about Hoid in a short while here, but let's pick up when the humans come to Roshar and kind of what happens in the more immediate term once these immigrants arrive on the planet. We meet the Heralds before they are Heralds, and at this point they have been given unfettered access to the surges by Odium. This is how Ashen becomes Ashen, why they are forced to flee. But a side effect of getting this power also causes them to age very slowly. Videl says, quote, "We're not immortal. The powers changed us, yes, but we are not eternal. You grow, Ash, slowly," end quote. So there she's talking to Shalash, whom we do see move through time, but age much slower than she should. I think she goes from seeming like she's about 12 to seeming like she's about 16 and then maybe eventually like 19 or 20. But that's over the course of hundreds, thousands of years.
Yeah, the first jump that we see for Ash specifically, I think, is that one from like a preteen or a very young teen to something like an older teen. And that is over a period of time of 50 years. So
Right.
at 50 years, she basically goes through normal teenage physical aging.
Yeah.
And I think we may talk a lot about how that impacts Ash before she becomes a Herald. That is from the powers of Ashen. Whatever had been either innate on Ashen or had been part of Odium's manipulations on Ashen.
Yeah, they say specifically that it's because of the surges, because of the powers that they have been granted.
Yes, and they've been granted surges by Odium. The question is still up in the air about how those surges came about and like what is the specific maybe manipulation that Odium does to change something innate on Ashen into the quote unquote surges that we see on display.
I mean, I don't think he's changing anything.
You think he's creating from whole cloth?
I don't think he's creating. I think he is providing a pathway to something that already exists.
Let me phrase it slightly different way, because in our last episode, we talked a lot about the formation of Roshar and the two other planets in the Rosharan system. And we know that there was life on Ashen with the humans and on Roshar with the singers that is predating the Shards as we know them. So they're creations of Adenalcium, and there is magic. There is investiture on these planets. And then we've talked about how the weird braze aspect is that it like attracts investiture for some reason.
Yeah.
And so my question is, like when honor and cultivation enhance the existing or the pre-existing life forms on Roshar, is Odium doing something like that? Or is it more like what Ruin and Preservation do on Scadrial, which is kind of creating the magic system around themselves? Is it a transition from one to the other, just like boosted by Odium? Or is it an Odium specific magic system? That's where the question I think is still up in the air.
I think that all magic systems are the same. They're all operating on the same fundamental underlying structure of the Cosmere. And just as we've talked about the fact that the Knights Radiant are arbitrary, like that is a human created system put on top of existing surges, just the way that we've talked about how surge binding can be used as a general term for just like using magic. You are tapping into the fundamental surges or forces that exist in the fabric of the Cosmere. I think that the metal system on Scadrial, as you're saying, Ruin and Preservation sort of created a system, but they didn't create, you know, gravity or emotions or any of the things that metallurgy is manipulating. They're just creating a pathway for humans to tap into the forces that already exist, which is the only thing that is happening on Roshar as well, whether that is through honor and cultivation or through Odium.
And the creation of those pathways, or like how the pathway is demonstrated, is how I have occasionally gone off in the past on wild tangents, speculating on what these pathways could be. And this might just be a little bit of a preview of what you can get over on Drunk History, because I'm not going to go too deep into this. But
oh, great. I have something to look forward to.
Yeah, you do. Everybody does. Because that question of what are the form or the pathway that Odium provided these surges to the early humans, I think this comes down to microorganisms, bacteria, and viruses. And this isn't me. This is Brandon.
No.
All the way from 2015. I want to bring in a word of Brandon just so that everybody's on the same page. Thank you so much for playing along. Will you be the questioner for this from the Firefight signing back in January of 2015? Just a fun shout out to all of you Reckoners fans.
Quote. So I was reading that one of the worlds, I think it was Yolen, is going to be a disease-oriented magic.
It's not Yolen, it's Ashen.
How does that work?
Viruses and bacteria, various strains of them, have evolved in line with the investiture on the planet to grant you a magical ability when you catch the disease, because they want you to stay alive long enough to
transmit it.
To transmit it. So it becomes part of the transmission vector. So you have superpowers or whatever, you can fly as long as you have the common cold. But when you get over it, you can't anymore. End quote.
Yes, I am aware that this is something that Brandon had once said as being part of the magic on Ashen. That is non-canon, I think we should note, because there has not been a canon book set on Ashen yet. However, that would be the magic, in my opinion, before Odium arrives.
Exactly.
So I don't think that that's the system that Odium is using. I get the impression that Odium, we've talked a lot about how on Scadrial, the metal is kind of a key, and the key opens a specific door for the person to access. I think that Odium has given them kind of an all access pass, which like is the mistake. He just kind of threw the door open and was like, go for it, take some power. And that is what goes so poorly on Ashen.
Exactly. It goes poorly. We know that it ends in Cataclysm. And so like this isn't the right call, regardless of if it was natural and boosted by Odium or if it was kind of designed purposefully by Odium. But you are completely correct that this is currently non-canon, and nothing in Wind and Truth hints at a virus or bacteria beginnings. And so this is just my speculation, based on word of Brandon's rather than in text, which is not as good. And I just hold on to this as the original thing that existed on Ashen, that there was some type of access to investiture via bacteria, via viruses. And then it's that pathway that Odium like opens the door on. So I think that is why the Heralds remain connected, because they're of that world. They are a walking factory for Ashen bacteria and viruses, and their specific bacterial makeup is the thing that is extending their life and keeping them tied back to Odium. That's my speculation. It is absolutely ridiculous, but you out there, you let me know how amazing that theory is. And I want you to tell us now about the group of people on Roshar, the singers, that the humans are bumping into.
Yeah, so obviously there's a lot of negotiation that has to happen when this large group of aliens comes to your planet and is like, hey guys, we need help. Like, we can't go home. Please shelter us. So the singers agree to give the humans the land that is going to eventually become Shinovar. When it's given to the humans, it looks very different from the way that we see Shinovar later on in the books. When it's originally given to them, it is incredibly difficult to grow food there. It's kind of this barren landscape, and the humans don't have the capabilities, the magic, the knowledge of the land to really make it a sustainable place for them to live. So obviously this causes a lot of conflict between these two groups. The humans are like, okay, I mean, thanks for the land. We do appreciate it, but also we can't live there. Like, we are going to die. We need to live where you're living, where your food is and stuff. And part of this agreement between them is that if humans want to live in the places where the singers live, where they have these stone sung buildings that are very sturdy against the high storms and they know how to grow food, etc.
In addition, it is said that in singer lands, quote, the wind, capitalized, sings to the plants and causes them to grow.
Right. Yes. So obviously the singers just have all these advantages, the advantages of being the native people of Roshar and already having probably thousands of years, established on the planet. But if humans want to go and live in the singer areas, they are required to come as servants of the singers. So they can live there. They can, benefit from all of the things that the singers have established, but they must do so as servants.
Meanwhile, as you said, the land that will become Shinovar is basically like a muddy plain with absolutely no plant life or seeming spren, a life of any type. And it is going to be something we witness over many of the flashbacks as the transition into the fertile kind of like grass prairie that eventually is on display by the time Kaladin and Szeth have arrived in the present day. But when they arrive, it is completely inhospitable. And therefore, the beginnings of the conflict are all lined up. All of the pieces and the setting already exist. If you have one group of people who are on land that they cannot farm and cannot subsist on, and there is fertile land close by, the conflict is inevitable. It's just a matter of time.
Yeah, and obviously both sides are right.
Of
You
course,
know,
yeah.
it totally makes sense that the singers would be like, yeah, you can come, but like, we're not just going to let you come in and like take all of the stuff that we have worked so hard for. And it also makes sense that the humans are upset that they are not able to survive really or thrive in the place that they are. So it's tough. And then on top of all this, of course, the high storms exist, and the high storms are raging through Roshar in their usual way. The singers are adapted, evolved for this land. The humans are not. And Honor really takes pity on them. We learn that the humans are able to pray to Honor, and Honor kind of mitigates the storm over Shinovar, protecting them. And this is kind of how we see the high storms happen later on.
Yeah, I think that this is a crucial moment because you have the thing of great power that the humans understand. Honor, who has visited them on Ashen and aided them on Ashen, guided them over to Roshar. They look to Honor as their deity. Simultaneously, they are introduced to the storms on Roshar, which are devastating from an ecological standpoint, and just unlike any power that they have seen maybe outside that cataclysmic moment on Ashen. And they begin to mentally merge these things in their mind. I think that the humans are starting to conflate the storms with power and, of course, Honor with power.
I don't know if that's right.
What we know at this time is that the Spren of Storms exist in a way that is not the Storm Father.
Correct.
And that the Storm Father will, because of intervention by Honor, but I think also because of the thoughts and the focus and maybe the prayers from the humans, it's boosted to the next tier of Spren.
Yes.
It's elevated, as a word that we've used previously.
Well, yeah, I think you're right. I think there's more than one thing happening, and we're going to do an entire episode all about the Stormfather, so we're not going to dive into like all of the creation, etc. right now. But I do think that there are two different things happening. One is Honor and Honor's interaction with the Spren of the Storms.
Exactly.
Secondarily, there is also a change because the humans view the high storms with such fear.
Exactly.
They are obviously much more focused on the high storms than they are a typical wind. And so we hear that the wind, capital W wind, starts to lose power as a lower percentage of the people on Roshar, I would say, are thinking about the wind, and a larger percentage start really fixating on this event of the high storm, which means that the Spren of Storms starts to gain power.
Brandon actually mentioned this in his Dragonsteel Nexus 2024 spoiler stream when he talked about those percentage changing, that like there's only so much investiture, so much energy that can be invested. And so as there is more attention and focus put onto the Spren of Storms, it has to come from somewhere. It didn't necessarily need to come from the wind. I don't think we have it, that explicitly stated. But in this event, think of what we've just laid out. The singers are praying or communicating with the wind to help them grow food, but the storms to the singers are just
way of life.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's not a big event necessarily. It's what happens every week or, every few days. It's just part of their environment that they've always existed in. And so there's no focus. It's not doing anything special for them. And we see the humans give that attention and that focus, which means the energy comes from somewhere as it's like balanced out between the wind and the storm.
Yeah, I think that's right, that the singers view it as just part of their environment. I think about this sometimes in relationship to Earth. Like every once in a while it occurs to me how strange it is that water just falls from the sky.
Yeah, just
here.
Oceans up in the sky in the form of clouds.
And like not every planet is like that, but I could imagine an alien coming to our world and just being like, what the heck? What is happening? Why is water falling on me? And so it's like that for the singers, and yet the humans sort of create this entire persona around the storm. We hear, quote, humans poorly adapted to this land began to fear the storm above all else, and so it took on life, became an adversary, a new demigod for Roshar, end quote.
As you mentioned, we're going to talk more about the Storm Father in a future episode, but it's this time period, which for the timeline nerds is about 7,092 years ago. That's when the humans arrive on Ashen. And then it's within the first 50 to 100 years, really just like the first couple of generations, where the pressure is felt because of this environmental difference, and humans start pushing out from the lands that were originally given to them. Often, I don't think always, but I do think often, the Makabak people are the ones who are on the forefront and kind of like, we're always the outside group on Ashen, right? They were like the enemies on Ashen. And then when they get to Roshar, I think it is remarked later about Nail. It's that are his people who are dying and like willing to push out to claim new land. And
I don't remember that. I
could be wrong
I'm
about
not
the
willing
specific,
to say that that's for sure true.
but I just think that, yeah, you have, even if it's not just the Makabak people, you have these humans who are willing to push the line and like push the boundary. And then the singers push back. And so the conflict is already there. And that boils up to the level of the shards. And that's when we come to the agreement between the three that's going to hold all the way until the end of Wind and Truth.
Because Odium has come with the humans to the planet of Roshar, and pretty quickly he starts kind of like flirting with the singers.
Yeah. Odium's been in an open relationship, but forgot to tell his partner, the humans. He's just like, yeah, I'm going to immediately go to the next group that sees and likes me.
I think they're in a fight. You know, if it's a relationship, this is definitely a we were on a break scenario. Like the humans are pissed because their planet is destroyed. And so I think they already have a little bit of like, we don't really trust Odium. In fact, we don't really trust any god. And the singers feel kind of abandoned because Honor, annoying freaking Honor, just running away from all his responsibilities of the people that he said he was going to care for, of his partner that he was like, yes, we'll be together forever. He's been just off on Ashen, like playing with other toys and being obsessed with this fight with Odium and kind of ignoring the singers after he was like, oh, but I love them. Let me take care of you.
And they are feeling abandoned. And that's why there's a couple of moments when Honor kind of remarks on the perception of time when he's saying things like, I was gone for just a moment, or was it a few centuries? You know, he's like having a huge disconnect between how long he has left. And so the singers, I don't think were abandoned for like a decade. I think it's generational. I think there's like this depiction of singers that have been without a god, because cultivation didn't step up. That was never her jive.
Right.
And so they have been abandoned maybe for a generation or two with like an elder population that maybe remembers the glory days when Honor was on Roshar for real. And then just a bunch of abandoned generations after. I have no idea what
I don't know if
it's
like. Been multiple generations, but it's been like several decades.
Yeah, I thought there were a description of he's been gone centuries from...
at some points, yes, but I don't believe that is this point.
What is true is that the three shards are going to get into this Mexican standoff. They're all kind of pointing at one another as they try to claim territory and claim populations, claim people on Roshar. And we're going to arrive at this delicate balance that is struck and is going to define the rest of the Stormlight Archive and everything that comes after.
Yeah. Honor and Cultivation are finally like, okay, we got to do something about this guy. They sort of gear up to attack him, but Odium is like, what do you guys think is going to happen when you attack me? Yeah, everything is going to be destroyed, including this planet that you really like. So they can't fight him directly, but they also don't really want to fight a cold war like they did on Ashen because that went so terribly. And so Cultivation proposes that they impose limits on what they're able to do and how they're able to use the mortals in order to hopefully prevent a cataclysm occurring again. Honor says that he even sees genius in this plan of Cultivation's. So apparently it's a very good plan.
It does seem like this is Cultivation's master stroke. Like this is her real contribution to the Shard War, at least in this stage. Who knows what's going to happen in the future. But in this stage, she designs a system of checks and balances or a system of restrictions and regulations on the power that can be granted to individuals. Honor says this, quote, "One could grant great powers to individuals if they were willing to bend to divine rules as we did, or instead, lesser power could be given indiscriminately to many," end quote. I think that this is also just a microcosm of what we see on display across the rest of the Cosmere. It seems like that balance is also kind of how other planets have played out as well. You have a bead of Lerasium that can grant the most potent form of misbornness to a human, or there is mistings and fairings that are only possible in the second era, right? It's more distributed power rather than concentrated in individuals.
I think that breaths are probably the best example of the lesser power given indiscriminately to many.
Of course, that's the most distributed.
Right. So each person is born with one little piece, but they can do, whatever they want with that little piece of power.
Yeah. Always interesting to me when it comes to breath as well, that they're so in control of that power. That power is like connected to their soul and they have to willingly give it away. It's not something that can just be taken, like vials of metals or something along those lines.
I do want to read the rest of that quote that you read just a minute ago because I'm curious your thoughts on it. It continues, quote, "Brilliant," I whispered to her. "With these restrictions, no mortal would ever be powerful enough to destroy the planet. Unless... No, that was ridiculous to consider," end quote. What do you think that Honor is thinking in this unless, no, this is ridiculous?
The question of what is the ridiculous thought that Honor had is haunting me. Ever since I heard about it, I was just hyper focused on this issue of, okay, so we have restrictions that are applied by the Shards. I think that this is very clearly an example that is going to be most on display with the Radiants that we'll talk about later, but they apply a bunch more restrictions on themselves. And even more so than Honor did originally. But those restrictions are intended to inform the group and to guide the group in a better path. And so I'm wondering, from the examples that we have, the only thing that I can think of is Unchained Radiance.
I am wondering if this is about Shards. If he's sort of worrying about or perhaps seeing a future where a mortal takes his power in the same way that he took Adonalsium's power.
Right. And so like my concept that we kind of think Dalinar is, still don't know what it means entirely, but the Unchained Bondsmith as like the most dangerous thing in the Cosmere. I don't think Dalinar ever reached this height necessarily, but we keep hearing things or seeing these flashbacks when there's moments mentioned about the power of bondsmiths, about the ability to bind gods themselves. And I'm wondering if that's kind of what Honor is thinking about here is, this plan is so good. Nobody could ever break the divine rules unless there was someone who could define the rules as they saw fit. An unchained bondsmith is my example. And they can redefine the system.
I find it hard to imagine that a mortal, even a very powerful mortal, would be able to somehow tamper with a an agreement made between gods.
But you already pointed out that it's happened, that mortals took down Adenalsium. And
But that wasn't an agreement between gods.
It's an agreement kind of God with his people.
Maybe.
And we have
no idea.
I mean, we don't have any idea about what was going on that caused the mortals of the 17 shards to go against Adenalsium. But yeah, I think that Honor knows that it's possible to subvert the will of a god because he did it.
Well, and I think at this point, he already knows that he's struggling with the power.
Definitely.
That he and the power are having some issues.
Exactly.
So I think maybe that is his fear, that he will somehow lose control of the power, or the power will
choose someone else.
Oh,
that's very interesting, because that's a huge problem with Odium and Ba-Edo Mishram, right?
Yeah.
And the concept that Ba-Edo Mishram is like the proper
She's like the perfect vessel
for the power of Odium.
Yeah.
And Odium knows that, and each of the vessels kind of knows that the power is really attracted to Ba-Edo Mishram. Man, that would be weird, because it's not even like your spouse is attracted to someone else. It is that the split part of you, this other thing that is also you, the vessel and the power are kind of one thing, but there is so much division that you can't even get into agreement about what you are attracted to. It's more like a person who has split personalities, who's married to a bunch of different partners and spouses. And like each one has legitimate love or attraction to their chosen partner. The power of Odium seems to really want Ba-Edo Mishram. Maybe Honor is worried that the power, his power, could want to flow to someone else.
Yeah.
You could be right. I don't know. Listeners, let us know if you have a theory about what Honor is so worried and then discards as ridiculous to consider.
Regardless, this agreement means that all three of the shards are bound to the Rosharan system. That's part of the deal. First, Odium resists this, but Cultivation threatens him with her getting the rest of the shards, and then they will, she says, deal with him as Adenalsium was. So maybe they still know where the Dawn shards are at this point, or she's just relying on them, like ganging up on Odium to destroy him. And then he's finally like, okay, no, it's fine. I'll be bound to the system.
And that binding of the gods is going to hold until the moment when Odium becomes retribution.
Yes.
Cultivation flees. And so like we know that the agreement is broken in that moment. And because of this agreement, we have all actions and all stories that will play out over the Stormlight Archive books. Let me ask you, do you want to go back and talk a little bit about Hoid?
Yes, let's talk about Hoid, because this whole section where we're seeing the humans come to Roshar, Hoid is with them. And there are some kind of brain-breaking moments with Hoid.
Yeah, I think this is going to be difficult to understand.
Scene. I think we're going to do like maybe a full hour on this, like half a page of notes. But let's go back just a little bit. We hear a little bit about Hoid's past on Yolen. He says, quote, "Before us were the dragons, before them the gods," end quote.
And that is small g and plural.
Yes.
That's not there was Adenalsium before them. And I find this very interesting.
So interesting. I honestly can't even begin to speculate what that is in relationship to. If it's the Aethers, if Adenalsium was one of a group, like who knows, but something to highlight, put a pin in. Maybe we'll hear more about this in the future.
Hoid also has this to say, quote, "I was young then, frightfully so. I'd somehow found a weapon destined to kill a god and was carrying it unwittingly," end quote. That's remarking about his time, the first time with the Dawn Shard.
Yes.
And maybe not even the first time.
Right. So he finds it when he is quite young and is unwittingly carrying it, at least to begin with. Again, not something we really have enough information to really speculate about, but certainly something worth noting. We know that Hoid is possibly partially responsible for what happens on Ashen. We hear this, quote, "He was there when we destroyed our previous world. Did your wit tell you that? that he was involved, perhaps even responsible. He told us about the shards, and it was his talk that led us to first contact Odium, end quote.
Huge news, but not necessarily surprising to me, because Hoid's blessing and his curse is something about always arriving in a place where he needs to be, because he is an integral part of the story in that moment. And so, yes, I always think that when Hoid is around, it is important and valuable. But this is exactly one of those examples where maybe Hoid learned in the past the difference between trying to push the boulder yourself or interfere directly with the path of the boulder and walking alongside it and bumping it at precisely the right moment, because maybe he tried to get more directly involved in Ashen. Maybe he arrived as the hero of Hoid and this kind of like mythical world hopper who shared a bunch of information about the shards beyond and was a hero to the people, and they loved him because he's Hoid, the trickster god, or whatever. You know, you can just imagine a far more rambunctious world hopping Hoid that then is corrected because of the cataclysm that's going to flow from those actions.
Yeah, I think it's safe to say that with a life as long as Hoid's, he's probably filled a lot of different roles in his time and has acted as different, different characters, different attributes throughout his time, and has changed over time in some ways. He then comes to Roshar with the humans. He comes on their immigration journey with them. In a vision, we see Hoid, and the Hoid in the vision is very strange. I am unsure if what we see in the vision is a faithful depiction of what happened in history, or if there's something about Hoid in the vision, like specifically Hoid in the vision, that is not actually Hoid from the past, if that makes sense.
I think I know what you're getting at, but let's break this down. As you said, let's go into way too much detail for something that doesn't actually take up that many characters on the page. But when you say the vision, you're talking about in the spiritual realm. This
Correct.
is Dalinar and Navani, their first breakthrough into the spiritual realm is visiting the moment. The Else Gate opens up, the humans come across. One of those humans is Hoid. And what transpires in the spiritual realm, and as you are saying, I don't think is history. I think that's what we learn throughout the rest of Wind and Truth, is that this is not the past. This is the spiritual realm filling in, like a dream mind fills in the details that the dreamer wants to exist.
I don't know if I would go that far. That would mean it's literally all fake, and I don't think that that's true. I think we are seeing what happened.
I think that you're seeing a version of what happened, but it would be the difference between, are you watching a movie about World War II? I'll use the famous Saving Private Ryan, big scene in the opening sequence on the storming of the beaches of Normandy. When you watch Saving Private Ryan, are you watching the storming of Normandy? Absolutely not. You are watching a movie that is depicting the storming of Normandy, but you're not standing on the beaches. You're not actually there. And the people in the spiritual realm are not actually at the arrival of the humans onto Roshar. They are in the spiritual realm. They are watching some type of movie, some type of play. And that's how Navani describes it to little Gavinor.
Yeah.
Now, that can be a description just to a child, but I think it's far more accurate about what is going on. I don't think that the spiritual realm shenanigans are real, and therefore, yeah, I don't think this Hoid is real at all. And most importantly, that Hoid doesn't think that he's real at all. And so let's read some of these quotes, because it is a mind bender. So try to stay with us here, folks.
Quote, "I'm not real, am I?" he said in a monotone.
Wit, Dalinar said. What's your other name?
"I have many," Wit said. "None of them are me. I'm power, trying to imitate him, but he knows too much, so he would know he's not real, and so I have to make myself know that I'm not real. But then I know." He put his hand to his head, his eyes bulging, and his face started to distort, melting like paint on a wall. End quote.
That to me says everything that I need to know from the spiritual realm in general, but then it's on display most with Hoid because he's the most powerful.
Okay, I think that's starting to make sense to me now. So you think that this quote unquote wit
Yes.
speaking is the power of the spiritual realm?
Yes.
Sort of like gaining a little bit of sentience and being like, I'm trying to render
Yes.
the character that I'm supposed to, but I can't.
Correct. I mean, render is a great word because there's obviously like a computer building a three-dimensional model. And so, yes, the spiritual realm has gotten code. It's gotten a command to render a scene from the past.
Mm-hmm.
And it's trying to render as fast as it can. And then it comes upon a thing that has so much code, so many inputs, so much information, so much power in the form of Hoid that it can't fully render out. Because one of the first problems with giving a bunch of power in the Cosmere is that that power wants to be sentient.
Mm-hmm.
And the power of Hoid knows that fact. And so it gets into a recursive loop of like, I cannot be real because to be real, I would need more power than I am getting. And it gets into this like broken loop of glitching and kind of like not fully rendering the final product because it couldn't possibly render the final product because the final product is Hoid. And on the journey of building a Hoid, the thing that was being built would get the input that Hoid knows it's fake. I know that's confusing. I definitely recognize that that's confusing, but that is my best understanding is basically that this thing at some point gets intelligent enough. It's dumped with so much power from the spiritual realm that it realizes that it cannot be Hoid because it's coming from the spiritual realm.
Like if Hoid were in the spiritual realm with Dalinar and Navani and were to meet this character, he would know, like he would understand too much of what was happening behind the curtain to really believe it. But then because that character is also Hoid, it can't like believe itself.
Exactly.
Which then means that it can't really be anything.
Whereas other vision characters that we see throughout Wind and Truth in the spiritual realm, not people being inhabited by some of our characters, like not those ones, but the other ones that are playing a part, they can believe that they are who they are rendered as.
Yeah.
When Yezrian shows up, he does think that he's Yezrian. And there's moments sometimes when things start to break and they start to like tweak out, and that's when Dalinar's talking about like we need to go along with the patterns that exist here, or everybody starts to freak out a bit if they get too far off the script. Hoid can never be on script because Hoid knows that he's in a play, and so this rendering knows that it's a play too.
I mean, it does render him a little bit, I guess. I don't know. We go on to hear things like this, quote, "Me," the faceless wit said, "Oh, I'm fine. Just a big mess of existential crisis. Me who is not me, knowing that I'll puff away back to nothing the moment this vision ends. It's fun, like realizing you've swallowed poison by accident." End quote.
That to me shows the horribleness of what is happening. Knowing that you've swallowed poison by accident, knowing that you're going to die or experience a tremendous amount of pain in the future, and there's nothing that you can do about it.
What a weird thing to be like born in a sense, like a consciousness comes into existence.
Exactly.
Is basically enlightened, like right off the bat, like is completely aware of all of the underlying mechanics and the fact that literally at any moment it will just stop existing again. What a weird thing.
But then it gets even weirder because of what he starts to say as he's deteriorating in some respects. He says this, quote, "It's fine," he said. "I'm not real, so my emotions don't matter. My pain is an illusion, and I'm a puppet for raw investiture, propped up and speaking like the sock on a child's hand." He cocked his head. "Damn, is this how the Iriali feel all the time? No wonder they're so storming odd," end quote.
What does that mean?
The Iriali should feel like a sock on a child's hand? That's what Hoid's saying, right?
Yeah.
And he in this moment says he's a puppet for raw investiture.
Okay.
I think the
so
Iriali
maybe...
are some type of avatar, but a group.
No. I think he's talking about their religion, the
Of course.
religion of the one, and how, in this case, this consciousness, I'm not even going to call it wit because it's not really wit.
It's just like a vision
This
Hoid.
consciousness is sort of similar to the way that the Iriali imagine the world, in that they imagine that they are all extensions of the one.
Yes.
Created to have a specific experience, but like ultimately they are not individuals.
And that's exactly what this Hoid vision is experiencing.
Yeah, exactly. Where he's saying like, I'm aware of the infinite investiture, or like capital G God, you could say, divine, whatever, however you want to define that. I'm aware of the divinity that has created me as a specific thing to talk, etc., which is basically also what the Iriali believe, that they have been created by the one as a specific individual to talk and have a specific experience, and then they will be absorbed back into the one.
Near the end of his breaking down from the scene, we have this quote, "He flopped back in the mud, blank face toward the sky, mumbling to himself about things like infinite recursion and synthetic consciousness," end quote. So I think you're right. I think he is experiencing the universe. He is a drugged out kid who took mushrooms for the first time, and he's opened himself to all things and realized that he and the universe are in a line, and that there's a synthetic consciousness of the spiritual realm that is made up of all the little...
I mean, I think he would be the synthetic consciousness.
I think he's the synthetic consciousness, but he's attached to the larger consciousness, which means that everyone is a synthetic consciousness. And how different is the synthetic consciousness that exists right now in this vision in the spiritual realm compared to the actual Hoid who walks around? Isn't he too just a synthetic consciousness
I don't know, man.
by powers of raw investiture, but that have changed shape and become physical matter instead of just raw investiture? It's now gone through a couple of process changes and ended up as axi, or atoms, and those atoms have collided together to make matter, and so on and so forth. And basically this is what Hoid is experiencing, or at least that's what I imagine he's experiencing.
You think real Hoid is also experiencing this?
No, I think that maybe real Hoid is experiencing this, but then like an adult who has recovered from the moment of being high on mushrooms in college and then processed that and advanced beyond it. I think, yes, real Hoid has advanced beyond this recognition.
I think that real Hoid has put in place certain tools and structures to safeguard his mind.
Oh, I mean,
from,
I think
from like this exact thing, basically.
Yeah, I think that's what a lot of people do after they consume a tremendous amount of drugs as well.
Oh, yeah.
They're like, yeah, reality is going to be how I define it very rigidly, and they'll, reinforce their own ego. Not everybody goes down the very, I'm using a incredibly stereotypical type of path, but like most people who do drugs just end up being exactly who they were beforehand, and they have like one moment of interestingness and then they revert back to their normal understanding of reality. And they don't walk around talking about how like we're all infinite one and like everything is energy flowing from one thing to the other and there's a shared consciousness. That's not how most people walk around. They go, I am me and I live in a box and I go to my job and everything is totally normal. And it is far more comforting in many ways to live that life than to live a completely stoned life at all times. That seems stressful, if I'm going to be honest. I don't want to live that. And maybe that's what a bad trip is like. I don't have enough experience to talk about these things in detail. But Hoid, the spirit version, seems to be on a really weird trip right now, where he's experiencing everything kind of simultaneously.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's basically a brand new consciousness. Like I said, it's like a new being born, except that it's born as a fully enlightened adult.
And we actually have a word for this too. Could you read this last quote that we have?
Quote, "He just watched Ashen die," the homunculus said. "It was one of his first great failures. Not his absolute first, but one of them. He spent the next week staring at the sky, worrying that he was too old at 3,000, that he was losing himself. The thing stumbled away. I must do that. I must do that." end quote.
Certainly aspects that I don't understand. But that first line, a homunculus, is that what we would call this Hoid vision spirit thingamajig?
Apparently.
So there's the phrase, there's the title. And I do think that this is very important because of what is going to happen later in the spiritual realm and something we'll talk about in more detail. But it involves the creation of the Blackthorn and what that means going forward after Wind and Truth. Because if this is a homunculus, then so too was the Blackthorn. He was a homunculus and was given, well, I don't want to go too far,
Yeah.
but stay tuned, folks, for more of my thoughts on homunculus Blackthorn.
I do wonder if that's a little bit different, but yeah, we'll get there when we get there.
Certainly a lot more in store when it comes to the spiritual realm, but I want to refocus us onto the shards and what kicks off this arms race between them, because we have the agreement that binds them to the planet.
Yes, they've made the agreement. They are bound to the planet in exchange for being able to grant mortals powers in a limited way so that they can fight. Like that's the deal. They're like, we'll stay here and fight, but we're only allowed to have certain weapons.
And so, as it often does with proxy wars, the large powers, the superpowers, are fueling the conflict between the singers and between the humans. And I think this should never be forgotten because there's a lot to say, or we could point the fingers at individual bad actors. Dalinar and Gavilar's conquest is a military conquest. It involved a bunch of death, some of it accidental, some of it, most of it, purposeful. Like they wanted to, those are bad people. However, they are at all times from this original agreement in a position where the superpowers in the form of the shards are fueling the conflict between these races. And I don't think we should forget that. That this is not just like a normal setting, that this is purposeful. And Odium has like specific reasons he wants this to happen.
Right. As we said, there's already some conflict happening between humans and singers, but you have to wonder, would that conflict have been able to be resolved if not for these superpowers, as you say, continually fanning the flames and giving them more and more powerful weapons so that the conflict would never be resolved.
Exactly.
We see at several points that there are factions within each group that want peace, or that humans and singers are able to be friends, have relationships across groups, etc. And so I think the biggest factor in the never-ending war is the shards. And it goes a little bit like this, quote, "First his fused, then my heralds, then his unmade, then my radiance," end quote. And over time, we have speculated a lot about what exactly the kind of order of the one-upsmanship has gone. And now we have it in black and white.
And we also have the rough estimation about time as well, because the fused are made about 7,000 years ago. Then we have the creation of the Heralds, a generation or 2 generations after that, so something like 50 to 100 years after that. And then the Unmade are remarked to be created about 6,400 years ago. So there's a gap somewhere of about 500 years when there's no Unmade, and it's basically just fused versus Heralds. That includes multiple early desolations.
Right. And we hear that the fused are more limited in their powers, which we do see on display in the Stormlight Archive. And that allows Odium to have some extra power or strength kind of in reserve that he is then able to portion off to the Unmade. The creation of the Unmade is hidden from Honor.
Unfortunately.
So we still know nothing about them. This was a thing that I really thought we were going to get answers about in Wind and Truth. I thought this was going to be like a major plot point that kind of the Unmade situation was going to be maybe not resolved, but like at least the first chapter of it would kind of be wrapped up and concluded, and we would get some answers, and we got basically nothing at all.
Literally, Honor himself doesn't know how the Unmade are created.
Yeah.
And so nobody knows how the Unmade are created.
In fact, Honor is like, they're kind of creepy.
Right.
He's like, I don't know, man, they're weird. And I'm like, you're very unhelpful.
So we can continue to speculate, and maybe over the years we will speculate more about the Unmade, but they are created in secret. And it's also remarked on by Adolin that, quote, Regals didn't really have a counterpart in the human military. Unmade were like Heralds and fused like Radiants. The Regals were perhaps special forces, but enhanced ones, end quote. So I think the Regals are maybe an example of this more distributed power handed out sporadically using the Stormfather and the Everstorm eventually. But like it's using a physical process on Roshar and the forms native to the singers.
Well, I think the forms granted to Regals are specifically of Odium and are not necessarily quote unquote native. Like they didn't exist.
The mechanism of form change
Right.
is native.
Yeah.
Whereas what's happening with the fused is not a manipulation of something. It is one body that is having the cognitive shadow of another entity slammed inside of it.
It's a new thing being created.
Exactly.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, where I think the regal forms are just that. They are form enhancements on the already existing biology of the singers.
100%.
Which is why there can't be a human version, because the humans don't have the ability to do that. There's no way to create.
The humans version is Radiance.
Adolin...
Instead of taking a spren into their gem heart, they form a bond in a different way that allows them to like sort of access, you know, a different form in that they're able to access the surges.
I would agree. Adolin says that the Unmade are the equivalent of the Heralds and the Fused are the equivalent of the Radiants. And I think he's talking about power structure and use within the military. You're right that functionally it happens. The Fused come first and the Radiants come last. Mm-hmm. And so they're not really directly comparable.
Yeah.
But let's talk first about the Oathpact, because this is within 50 years of the creation of the Fused. The humans realize that they are tremendously outgunned, and we have the elevation to Heralds and the formation of the Oathpact.
And this is largely in response to the fact that the Fused are undying, and that obviously makes a war a little bit more difficult. And so the humans need something to counter that. And Ashar comes up with this plan to make the Heralds. I think at this point, Ashar pretty clearly displays a desire to be a god or to be immortal.
Yeah, the megalomania is coming in.
100%. Like, I don't know if Ishar was ever not a megalomaniac. And he sort of tries to hide this fact by saying that his only interest is to protect the world. But we hear him say, quote, "Haven't you felt it?" Ishar asked him, his tone changing from defensive to concerned. "Doesn't it unnerve you? Our bodies aging, albeit slowly? You may think I'm selfish, but I'm frightened of old age, Videl. I do not want to be senile for 1,000 years. End quote.
This may be what all of the heraldness is actually about. This is a man who, like many men and women in the real world, are facing a dark future where they are going to deteriorate physically and mentally and then die. And for Ishar and these select people who are in power, that may be occurring over centuries or even 1,000+ years, which is far darker than like what happens to humans when they get old. But I'm guessing that almost every human, when they hit an age above like 70, is just looking at their future and is pretty sad about what they have in store for them. In this respect, Ishar is like, I don't need to do that. I can be a god. I can be a little mini demigod.
Yeah.
And leans in to the Herald story. But really it comes down to the same thing that everybody's afraid of, which is dying and getting old.
I mean, fine. But I think it's pretty obvious that at least most of the other Heralds do not have this same motivation. And Ishar takes this pretty personal, pretty selfish motivation and creates a system, creates this quote unquote solution that leads to a lot of pain and suffering for the other heralds. You know what I mean? Like, I think the ultimate outcome is probably bad for basically everyone. And Ashar is the instigator of this for entirely selfish reasons.
Yeah, I think it may be very similar to what happened with the original 17 who go to kill ad nauseam. They're like, we know better. We are the ones that can fix it. Only us can fix it. And so we need to do this thing. Either kill God on the one hand, or become truly immortal heralds on the other hand.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think Ashar is thinking, I can fix it. I think he is thinking, I need more power.
Yeah.
And then I'm going to pretend like, oh no, really, this is just because I want to fix things. And it's not.
And I think that is on display with the shard vessels as well. Each of them is personally motivated by slightly different things, but they all come together and agree to take the actions that their groups decide on. And so whatever their motivation is, they are coming to this agreement and bringing their own motivations. Ishar's is a little bit more on display.
And Ashar is the one that starts it, I think, is the difference, you know?
And I wonder, obviously I don't have the answer, but it seems like if the problem was an undying group of super soldiers in the form of the fused, creating another group of undying super soldiers might not be the answer. It's just the obvious thing to do. Like, it's very dumb when you think about...
I mean, it's such a convenient excuse, right? That Ashar is able to be like, oh, darn, I guess we're just gonna also have to be undying. Shoot, not something I've ever wanted before.
And you think it's so convenient that it aligns so perfectly with Ashar's selfish desires that it all has to be selfish.
Right.
I would probably agree. I will just always remind us that the reason we like Captain America is because he's the person who doesn't want power, and it's thrust upon him by someone else.
Yeah, that's also why we like Taln.
Yes, 100%.
Yeah.
So let's talk about some of these other heralds. I went to a Marvel universe. I'm like, I'm in the Cosmere universe.
Exactly.
I don't need to go anywhere. I have Tom.
So Ashar comes up with the plan and sort of presents it to Honor. Honor is like, cool, that sounds good. You're really smart, but it's super important that we have oaths to govern this granting of powers to you so that we can prevent this unfettered and like dangerous access to surges that we saw on Ashen. And Honor remarks to himself, quote, if one of us were to die, then our followers would be able to draw power without being bound, as our will was what maintained the covenant, end quote.
Very interesting line.
Yeah. So he is very conscious of the fact that, yes, they've put these safeguards in place with the agreement, but if one of them is to die, those safeguards go away.
They go away, but the power remains because it's his will that is doing the binding. And so when he is gone, that breaks apart. The binding, like a solvent, is used and just kind of like dissolves.
Only the rules go away.
Exactly,
but the
but not the
access to power stays.
100%.
Yeah. Most of the heralds have some misgivings about this plan. Yezrian doesn't want to be a deity. Videl doesn't really want to be so closely involved with the gods. They're still pretty skeptical about these powers because of what happened on Ashen. Nail is still pretty antagonistic towards the other heralds. He's very hesitant to use similar powers to what destroyed Ashen. So we see all of the other heralds questioning, not totally sure about this. Ashar is super into it. Tanavast also is like pretty into it, thinks it's fine. He feels pretty confident about the power of oaths, etc., to mitigate any problems. And the heralds, the people who will become the heralds shortly, are the perfect candidates for Ishar's plan because, quote, most of you once served him, Tanavast said. He granted you his powers. There is a connection we can exploit, so long as the circle contains enough of you. If you speak oaths to me, my power can be channeled and governed by rules to prevent a cataclysm. I will take back your surges, then grant them anew, and together you will become a force that both protects Roshar and binds the enemy away from it. End quote.
So we have a lot of the mechanics that are being introduced here.
Yes.
One, they have a connection to Odium. That seems to be essential or really important to what is going on.
It is essential. Yes, that's kind of the only way that this whole idea works, is using this existing capital C connection.
But Taln doesn't have that connection, is my understanding. So it's not that everyone needs to have it.
Well, yes, we'll get there in a second, but they're specifically looking for another person that has a capital C connection to the gods.
To the gods, right,
Yes.
but not to Odium specifically. Most of them have this direct connection to Odium, and they're going to use that pathway of connection, exploit it to bind Odium in a unique way. Honor is going to take their existing surge binding and give it back to them in a new form, flavored by Honor this time. And that is going to be the surges that they have on display as heralds.
Right. And we see before they become heralds that they do have different abilities.
Mhm.
We see, I think it's like the herald that becomes the truth watcher herald. We see her doing things, or,
Right.
you know, it's all kind of like mixed up. They have different specialties originally before they become heralds. And then they receive the powers through Honor, and there are different rules. This circle must contain a specific number of people. We hear that the strongest number would be 16. I think we know for obvious reasons. And then Honor also says that 10 would be a good number because that's his favorite number. But he notes specifically that it cannot be 9.
Of course, interesting because there is 9 of so many different things. There are 9 heralds that break the Oathpact. There are 9 unmade, all for reasons we don't understand, but we think that 9 is associated with Odium in the same way that 10 is with Honor. But it also is remarked that 1 could do this as well. It's just that no one person would ever be capable of holding back the forces of Odium alone for 4,000 years, except for Taln. And
Right.
before we jump over to everybody's favorite, we are also told that the binding requires the heralds to travel to Braze and, quote, its well of souls in order to seal the enemy away from Roshar. Your pact will complete the blessing that Odium began, then rejected, but you will become mine instead of his, end quote.
Right. So in taking away their original surge binding and then re-granting new surges to them, the Herald's capital C connection with Odium is replaced with a capital C connection to Honor. Important. That's going to become very important in the new Oathpact when we finally get there. So just remember that. Here's how it happened. Quote, Ishar mouthed words of intent, then touched Honor and drew out a powerful cord of light.
This will start the bond, Ishar said. Only once it is complete can Videl seal immortality upon us, using our connection to Honor to tap into constantly rejuvenating investiture from the spiritual realm, locking our souls at our current age. This way, we can be reborn again and again, end quote. So there it is, folks. That is the description, the most clear example I know of exactly what is happening with the Heralds. Videl seals their immortality, and then the connection to Honor allows them to continuously tap into the spiritual realm. And it is from that their surges flow. It is from that they are able to rebuild their bodies, their physical bodies, when they return. So they are cognitive shadows, but unlike Vasher, who has a physical body that has been sustained for the last 300 years, the Heralds are a cognitive shadow that remake their physical body upon returning. And they do that by pulling directly out of the spiritual realm.
I mean, to be clear, I think that their physical bodies would also sustain themselves for hundreds or thousands of years if they didn't die. But they do die and they're able to regenerate. Whereas if Vasher dies, presumably he's just dead.
Correct. Yeah, I definitely think
Yeah.
that they enter into the problem that Vasher is dealing with of old age and decaying, not necessarily of the body, but of the mind. And I think that we also have, at this time, the creation of the Oathpact, there is an important piece that is struck between Nail and Yezrian, and they attempt to kind of bury the hatchet for all that has come before them. And we know that Nail feels very strongly and very positively about Yezrian by the time of Stormlight Archive. He does seem to treat him more as a friend than as like a scorned former enemy or anything along that.
Yeah, they come together in this moment of desire to protect humanity rather than being divided by interhuman factions. However, there's only 9 people. There's only 9 of these Surge Binders from Ashen willing to take on the Oathpact. They need a 10th person in order to create this bond. And as we mentioned before, it's better if this person has had some connection to the gods. Yezrian and Tanavast offer this spot to Hoid. Tanavast says to him, quote, "I think you're the only one among us who showed an ounce of wisdom on that day," end quote, meaning the day of the shattering, of course. But Hoid declines this oath pact. And then Nail recommends Talm, because of course Talm has had contact with the gods, and Nail makes the really good point that it's really important for a regular person to be part of this pact, someone who will remember the people that they are fighting for.
And is of the people rather than a leader who has this long history. Talm seems to be of a entirely different class. He is defined as a horse keeper and a soldier for many years that was removed from the front lines and also forbidden to carry a weapon, which makes sense somewhat because when Taln is unleashed, the Bearer of Agonies breaks through. I don't even know if he needed a weapon in that moment to kill a bunch of fused and all of those storm forms.
That is after access to surges and literally thousands of years of practice. So
They knew. They were like, Talon is the most OG of any of the fighters. He is, as a herald, defined as the best fighter. I wonder if that held. And he was someone like Kaladin, a naturally gifted fighter who was then trained by years of combat to become excellent. Something like the best that a soldier could be. In the same way that Kaladin is like the best spearman that anybody knows.
I think he was probably a good fighter. I think he was removed from service and forbidden weapons because of his attempt to kill cultivation, which Yezrian says warped his soul. Very interesting. I don't know how much that is meant to be literal and how much that is meant to be just Yezrian being mean basically to Talm because of this attempt on cultivation's life, attempt to kill one of their gods.
What I could imagine, though, from what we see at the end of Wind and Truth, we have this immense amount of power that is on display, first from the clash between Dalinar Honor and Odium, but then also from the birth of Retribution, that it warps space and time around Roshar, creating the time dilation. I think that if you were to strike at cultivation in a moment that nearly killed her, when she needed to like turn on all of her godly power to avoid death, that if you were the thing that was about to cause her death, you would have some type of dilation. And that's where I think he's warped in a sense. He's warped in the same way that time and space are warped around Roshar.
I don't really buy that.
On the spiritual level. That's all I'm saying. And I wonder if the warping makes him more open to what I think is going to come later for all of the heralds, but I believe maybe Taln specifically. But this is why he's called in. He's called in because of his attack on cultivation, the connection to the god.
And why? Why did he attempt to kill cultivation? Presumably it is because of this kind of grudge that he has against seemingly all gods as well as these becoming heralds, these people who are about to become heralds. He blames them for the destruction of Ashen, or as he calls it, his quote, grandmother's world, end quote.
Yeah, so I think that's, again, important to set the time. Taln's grandmother is a person on Ashen, whereas Yezrian and Ash and all of these, they are the people on Ashen. They
Right.
are of his
Yeah.
grandmother's generation or even older. And so it's a totally different vibe. From my understanding, Taln either came over as a baby from Ashen or he was born on Roshar. I'm not sure which one is true.
He's also very different from the other heralds in that he's kind of the opposite of Ishar. He's completely unswayed by the idea of power. Tanavast is like, we're offering you immortality. Don't you want that? And then they have this exchange, quote, I have heard too many stories, Taln said. Living out those eons doesn't suit men well. Though if you have a new pair of sandals, I wouldn't mind those.
I offer powers unimaginable, Tanavast said.
I can imagine quite a lot, Taln said, and some of it is downright terrible. I think I will pass, end quote.
The man after my own heart. Obviously, the person you should give power to is the Taln who doesn't want any power. And importantly, Tanavast is saying things like, I'll give you unimaginable power. And Taln's response is, most of the things I can imagine are really bad. Why would you give the power to do really bad things if you had the choice, which Tanavast does in this instance?
And I think one of the most interesting and important aspect of this quote is that he asks for a new pair of sandals, and sort of this pointed highlighting of the fact that people with power, the heralds, Tanavast, could be using their power to give regular people the things they actually need in their day-to-day lives.
Why are there no shard shovels?
Yes, why are there no shard shovels? So Taln is here saying like, look, dude, I don't want eternal life. I want a good pair of shoes. I want enough food. I want shelter. Like, I just want the basic things. Can you do that for me?
Yeah.
Like, stop waving your, gold and immortal life in my face. That's not what I want. You have the power. You could be using it to do really useful things.
Yeah. Batman, we don't need you to be punching bad guys in the street. We need you and other billionaires to be paying your taxes.
Yeah.
Like, that's really what we require of you. And so too is the same with Tanavast. You could be doing other things to help, and you've chosen this path of violence.
Yeah, you keep building weapons, and I would like sandals. And so the heralds go on to sort of explain that this Oathpact is going to mean a lot of pain and sacrifice on the part of the heralds so that they can protect the people. And Taln confirms with him that if he doesn't say yes, they're going to ask someone else. Like it's going to happen with or without him. And they say, yeah, that is what we'll do. And I think it's really notable here that Taln spends about 2 minutes just silent, thinking, like really considering this offer. It reminds me of a quote from Tress of the Emerald Sea, where Hoid goes at great lengths to point out that Tress does something sort of shocking that not enough people do. She just sits and she thinks and like thoughtfully considers something. And we have another one of those moments here. And then he finally agrees. He notes specifically that he is not fighting on behalf of honor, but he is fighting to protect Roshar and to protect the people.
Exactly. And that is why I think that Taln is going to become the most attuned with the powers of Roshar, with this other ability.
With the forces.
Yes, the forces of Roshar. So I think, he's warped, which we hear so often when the spiritual DNA of someone is broken or warped. It allows for investiture to kind of fill the spaces. That's what a Radiant Spren kind of does with their Radiant. It's said that something similar happens with Mistborns or Mistings on Scadrial. And so like there's a broken bit and then something can fill that broken bit. I have some speculation that Taln's warped and broken nature is filled by the powers of Roshar. And that's why he's going to be so powerful in the future. But from Honor's perspective, we hear this, quote, "Their souls worked after the fashion of my own, which trapped odium in the system, upon the fused. This was a wonderful solution. It let them experience in a small way what it was to be divine," end quote. And I find that description so interesting coming from Honor, who's saying the thing that it is to be divine is to bind other things.
I mean,
And
maybe
then,
he's just saying like having the power to bind other things is divine.
right, because of, yeah, you have power over those things if you have the choice to bind them.
Yeah.
But I think it's interesting too, because Syl defines herself and Honor Sprens in regards to binding. And
Well, she says she's a spren of oaths, right?
yes, and
Yeah.
the key factor of an oath is that it binds you through your promise, through your words. And she also defines herself as nobility. And I think that both of those in conjunction kind of like have a lot of bad connotations tied up with them. That oaths, we've talked about how they're huge problems, and Adolin likes promises over oaths. Nobility, clearly, you can point to nobles in any of the Cosmere stories, and there's problems with the nobles because they have power over other people.
Well,
right?
I think when Syl says that, she's speaking of the quality, not of the social station.
I agree.
While she is spren nobility, she is also a spren of nobility.
Yes. I hear you.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting that's how she defines herself. And then Honor defines an aspect of being divine as having power to bind others.
Yeah.
Let's talk about some of those other heralds and kind of how they are operating.
After they become heralds and the Oathpact is complete, we also have the creation of the Honor Blade. Quote, 10 people in a circle, hands outstretched. Dalinar's heart trembled as, one at a time, Honor pulled something from within his chest and held it out. A glowing splinter of light that formed a shard blade when it touched a herald's waiting hand. End quote.
So I think this is a full confirmation of something we've talked about previously. The Honor Blades are a splinter of honor.
Yes.
And the power that they invoke is independent of other things. For example, independent of Nail's Spren.
Yes.
Independent of Syl to Kaladin. When Kaladin gets his honor spear at the end of Wind and Truth, that's not Syl taking a new form.
Right, correct.
That is this. Except we see the piece branch off from Dalinar as he's defeated. And it said, I believe, more than one piece break off from Dalinar.
Is that what
in that
you
moment.
think that is? You think that the pieces that leave are the blade?
I think one of them is. I think that there are multiple pieces
okay.
that we don't know what they're for, but that one of them becomes the honor spear of Kaladin because of this scene where we see the original ones created.
Yeah.
And they're like very clearly splinters. We also know because of Nightblood and some of our party spren that the honor blades are sentient, that the honor blades can speak, that the honor blades can teach and learn and can adapt to new people and have, like, who knows over how much time, started to solidify into their own personalities. All very interesting, all ripe for more speculation. But we know that there is more going on than just the Oathpact or just the Honor Blades. We know, too, that there is something happening with the powers of Roshar. You want to talk about this more?
In a similar way to the heralds being like divinity, like honor in this binding action, they are also bound to the Rosharan system.
Definitely.
The heralds and the fused. And that's because of their connection to their shards. Maybe because they are splinters? Not sure if it's just a like capital C connection thing or if it's like a all splinters thing, but they are impacted by this agreement between Honor and Odium. And then over time, the heralds gain powers, seemingly. Over time, Honor remarks that they're able to increasingly, quote, draw on the powers of Roshar itself, end quote, in addition to their herald powers. And Honor, again, unhelpfully, doesn't know why, like doesn't really know what is happening here.
He doesn't know what's happening, and he says that he is too embarrassed to tell them
Yeah.
about what is happening, like what he's witnessing,
Yeah.
because he doesn't have the explanation for
Yeah.
it. This is now thousands of years after the shattering. And I have said from the time that Honor arrives in the Rosharan system and cultivation joins him, I've said from that moment, he is gonna break. Like he's broken in that moment because of the arrival of Core. And now we're thousands of years past that moment. And to me, this is the biggest indicator of what is wrong with Honor, that he's so afraid of not knowing what's going on that he can't even explain to the people that it's happening to, that he's in this very personal, intimate relationship where he's like given a splinter of himself to these beings. And yet embarrassment is still coming up. You're God. You're supposed to be beyond
But that's the
petty
point.
things.
That's the point.
He's not. Yes.
Yeah,
and that's why I think
exactly.
it is problematic.
He is a little kid wearing his dad's coat, you
Yes.
know, feeling like he needs to pretend, he needs to put on the persona of a god.
Yeah.
When the reality is he is a mortal being holding a divine power.
Yeah, it's Ukrainian
Again,
nesting
a
dolls all the
different
way
thing.
down. Yeah, it's just him and the Heralds all pretending to be something greater than they are, all wearing the coats of someone bigger than they are themselves. But this power of Roshar, a musical power, a life power, the planet's power, is this Adenalcium's power? I don't know, but I want to know. I need to know. What is going on? How are Taln and Ash able to fight and kill so many people without access to their shard blades, without access to their surges?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that they are tapping into the surges in this is an unchained moment, right? Like this is how
You think the power of Roshar is unchained?
No, I think that
Oh.
the Heralds somehow have like broken out of the confines of agreements, powers, the Oathpact that they have been put in and are able to like mainline into the surges rather than going through the channel that has been very strictly established for them by Honor.
Yes, I would agree. I think that that makes them unchained, but I think that I think there are multiple examples of unchained, and we can like talk about them in specific ways, because I think that the pathways that Honor built up are eventually unchained as well, because he
Well-
dies. And so like,
Well, yes.
I think that this example, the powers of Roshar, yes, are unchained in that they're not checked and they're not given rules, but you have to be in alignment. Brandon said this, Word of Brandon last year or a couple years ago, is the concept of the Heralds have to be in alignment to fully be able to access their powers, which is maybe different than something like an Elantrian, and that's why on the hierarchy, Elantrians and Yumi are above Heralds, because the alignment is so important and significant for the Heralds. But I agree that it is an unchained nature. I just think it has nothing to do with Honor whatsoever.
Well, okay, we do actually have a moment when Tanavast says the words Unchained Heralds. Essentially, much time passes. Honor realizes that Odium is specifically trying to break Honor and Honor's forces emotionally by making all of the battles just as absolutely horrible and devastating as possible. And so in response, Honor, quote, decided to push the Heralds harder. I let them access my powers more fully, and those of Roshar itself. As long as I was bound by oaths, they would not be able to destroy the land, so it would be well, end quote. And he says specifically right after this that this creates unchained Heralds.
Okay, so he is allowing more power to be accessed via his avenues of power, and that is unchained to him.
Yes. So yeah, there's two things that happen. He originally notices that they're already tapping into the forces of Roshar over time. Then he is like, oh, I'll let you do this. I'll like give you access to more power, and sort of like opens the door.
Yeah, the floodgates are open by him.
Yeah, and specifically says that he is letting them access the powers of Roshar itself.
But they were already doing that.
Right.
He's full of shit.
Yeah, he is full of shit.
This is what I think is that what he's saying in this passage specifically is not true. he's trying to hold on. He's trying to like someone losing control, they just grip harder, right? He's trying to watch all of this terrible stuff happening, watch the thousands of years of conflict. He's losing in some respects. He feels himself breaking, and he's trying to maintain control by saying, here, let me give you all of this power. But I think they already had access to the powers of the Shard.
I think that's true, but I think he does also give them greater access. Like, I don't think it's just a lie.
No, I don't think it's just a lie, but I think it is him like dumping extra barbecue sauce on the already perfectly seasoned meat.
I mean, he's like, taking just take credit for something that they could have done by themselves.
I think so, yeah.
At least in some respects.
I think, that's what it is to me. I think that they have this connection to Roshar that is unexplainable by Honor, and then he just dumps more power to kind of overwhelm what they were doing themselves and maybe what Roshar was doing, because he didn't control it. And so now he's like, well, I opened the floodgates, and so clearly I gave you all that power because I opened the floodgates. And in reality, they might have had access to that power via a river system or something, more naturalistic.
Sure.
That is over a period of several thousand years. Just about 5,990 years ago, there is the creation of Urithiru and the sibling.
How do you know this?
How do we know this?
Yeah, where is this from? Because we had already talked about perhaps the sibling being created in our last episode, which would have been like thousands and thousands of years before this. So where is this coming from?
Well, okay, two things. Remember, the sibling defines her own creation in Wind and Truth, and she says that happens shortly after the creation of the Stormfather. So we have the Stormfather's creation, and then shortly thereafter, for a giant spren that doesn't understand time, the sibling defines her own creation. So she does not label herself as happening prior to the arrival of the Shards. She's saying, I was born somewhere after the creation of the Stormfather, which we know the date of. Of course, the only answer is the same as it's always been for where do I get this information? This comes from Jafu's timeline, the spot where I recommend all people go for when they're asking about timeline issues.
So we still have a mystery spren then. Like, what is the 10th spren that Honor and Cultivation created thousands of years ago? If it's not the sibling, then it's a question mark that we don't know anything about.
I think there is always a question of time when it comes to Shards. Like when they say they're going to do something and then when they actually do something, that could be thousands of years, and they could just be like, forgot about that time. But I don't necessarily think that those two things need to be opposite, but what may be different is the creation of the tower itself, which is what this moment is specific to. 5,990 years ago is the creation of Urithiru, the tower. Maybe you're right that the original spren is created. And that's a spren that doesn't necessarily have the same connections to all the emotions or the singers or the humans. It's kind of outside of the normal realm of spren.
Yeah.
And maybe the spren existed for blank amount of time, and then the tower is created, and that is then, like the elevation of Storm Spren into Stormfather, we would have elevation of sibling Spren into sibling of the tower, which has to be classified as an elevated Spren. But they might have created a non-elevated Spren the first time.
That would make more sense to me if the sibling was actually created long ago when the Radiant Spren were all first created, and then the tower is created at some point during these wars.
Desolations. Yeah. Exactly.
Because seemingly it's also just slightly after the Radiants begin to exist.
It's slightly before the Radiants begin to exist. So the sibling is about 5,900 to 6,000 years ago. And then the Radiants are created about 5,700 years ago. So there's about a 200 to 300 year period where the tower exists and there are no Radiants. But the first Radiants probably had access to Urithiru.
That seems weird to me too. Like, why would the tower be created if the Radiants didn't exist?
As always, let us go to the text for the actual description. Could you play this out with me? This is Jasnah talking to the sibling.
Quote, "When were you created, sibling?" Jasnah asked.
some 6,000 years ago, when the stones wanted a legacy in the form of a child of honor and cultivation, back when bondsmiths bonded not to Spren, but to the ancient forces left by gods. End quote. Again,
I have no idea what any of that means.
So much into one sentence. Like, what? This is so detailed. You have some 6,000 years ago. So that gives us our timeline, right? Then we have the stones, capital stones, want a legacy in the form of a child of honor and cultivation. So the stones are going to be responsible in part for, I think, the creation of the tower. I think that makes the most sense.
Yeah.
Is this creation of the tower might be different than the creation of the Spren itself, which is what you mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
But they say they want a legacy in the form of a child of honor and cultivation back when bondsmiths bonded not to Spren, but to the ancient forces left by the gods. So bondsmiths existed. They weren't bonding to the Spren like the sibling or the Stormfather. They were bonding to the ancient forces of Roshar.
Seemingly ad nauseum, since it says left by gods.
Yeah, they say left by gods, but they kind of mean left by one god. And then we know that Adonalsium did leave certain Spren, the stones, the wind, and the night. That's what I think the old bondsmiths bonded to. They bonded to those forces. The wind had a bondsmith. The night had a bondsmith.
Maybe.
And that model is changed by the different flavorings of honor and cultivation. And so instead of bondsmiths bonding to the wind, eventually they bond to the Stormfather. Instead of bonding to the stone, they bond to the sibling. And then instead of bonding to the night, maybe cultivation doesn't let anybody touch the Night Watcher anymore. But theoretically, that's the other third major spren for a bondsmith.
Maybe. I also think that we know that the siblings' mind or sort of grasp on human time is not a human's grasp on time.
Yeah. Or it's just as valuable as a human's grasp on time.
And so the sibling saying some 6,000 years ago, or describing being born like after the storm, shortly after the Stormfather or something like that. Like, I don't think we can take those at face value and think that they are for sure saying the correct thing. While we like to go to the text, we have to remember that in-world information is subject to error.
It's fine. You want to question the sibling. That's totally fine. That's just poking at our little friend, the sibling. Just be like, you're too dumb to understand time.
They're
sibling.
Pretty. Plus, they were asleep for a while.
Yes.
And so they're always saying things like, oh, just the other day when I was like bonded to Malishi. And it's like, that was hundreds of years ago, sibling.
What I do think is well established, though, is the creation of the Knights Radiant shortly thereafter. About 5,700 years ago, we have the creation of the Knights Radiant, not done purposefully or consciously by Honor. The Knights Radiant were created and empowered by the spren that Honor and Cultivation had created in the past, their 10 elevated spren.
Right. We have, quote, my radiants, which were not my conscious creation, but formed by pieces of me working independently. I crafted their oaths to maximize their abilities per Kor's contract and Ashar's advice, end quote.
Again, I feel the same type of vibe from Honor, who's just like gripping for control when he's not needed. The spren are able to do this, and the spren maybe are not binding their radiance in the same way. It's a little bit more unchained because it's what the spren want and what the spren consider to be valuable. And then Honor steps in and he's like, let me just bind y'all real quick.
Yeah, as pieces of Honor, I think that there is at least some element of restriction because all of Honor's power is restricted. So I don't know that these would be like unchained radiance before Honor stepped in. But I do think, yes, he's obviously concerned about maintaining some element of control because he's trying to prevent an Ashen from happening again. But two, he also says that he's able to maximize their abilities. So it could be that he also is able to give them access to more power than they would have been able to access if they were not under specific oaths or like specific channels created by Honor.
Yeah, because
and Roshar.
That brings us back to the original contract, which is you can empower some the more you restrict them. And so he's saying, I'm going to restrict you, little baby Radiance, but I'm also going to maximize your power.
Yeah, exactly. Because he's still looking for, you know, more and more weapons, more and more soldiers in this endless war against Odium. Honor believes that the Radiance should be stronger or better than the Fused, but the Fused often win the wars because they have the benefit of being able to learn over time because they do not die. And he says, quote, my system of radiance, inspired by the Herald of Wisdom, should have been the greater as they harnessed the power of oaths. But Race's immortal Fused learned more and more the longer they lived. Each war was cataclysmic, named a desolation by my ardent priests, neither side able to win, both sides beating the other senseless until at the end civilization was in ashes, end quote.
And this makes complete sense, is you have one group of people that are maintaining and lasting over time through the desolations, and you have others that are reset, some reset further back than when their societies began in the first place. Like you have some desolations that are so bad, it's like starting all the way over from sticks and stones. And then the people have to be like Kaladin or Yasna or Shallan. They have to be going through multiple traumas, including just trying to grow up on a war-torn planet. Like that would be difficult enough, but they also have to learn how to be Radiants and leaders and use their powers. And so you're cooking for 20 minimum years, but probably closer to like 30 years on Roshar to make a new Radiant who is equivalent to what you had when the Spren who made the Radiant lost that Radiant in the previous desolation and like came back with a new one. But then you need to cook them for 20 to 30 years. It's really hard to make Radiance.
Yeah, it is a little bit like Tortoise and the Hare, where Honor is trying to maximize for power, but like he might have been better off going the less restricted but less powerful to more people route that we see with the Fused. Like there's more of them and they tap out in their power quicker than Radiants do, but they have the incarnation abilities of the Heralds. And so that kind of, you know, slow roll over time just wears away.
Definitely think it is shown to wear away. And we have, this actually comes from the stones themselves. Quote, the Radiant Bond had organized and structured the powers. Something about using the powers without that structure had been dangerous because of the new gods, the stones thought with sorrow. They didn't understand. No one understood the alien stones at the place's heart. End quote.
This is one of the many fascinating pieces of information we learn from Venli's sections in Wind and Truth. I can't wait to hear everything that the stones have to say. The stones know all. I think when we finally hear from the stones, like they know the truth. They're not confused about time like the sibling. I think they're gonna
or the
know,
wind, right?
Yeah, they're gonna know everything. They've been around. I love this confirmation that the Radiant Bond structures and organizes the powers, but does not invent or create the powers, which is something we've been talking about for a long time, keeping in mind that this structure is entirely man-made and the powers exist outside of this structure. And then, I mean, alien stones, we'll do that episode soon on all of this.
What I think is important to take away from this description of the arms race, this description of the clash between civilizations, is that those who are fighting and dying and being tortured and being fused and being the creatures that the fused get slammed into every time they get returned, all of that is at the beckoning or the will of these shards. The shards have set up all of this, and we hear, or we want the perspective of the shards we like, honor and cultivation, to be good and noble. And I am, after Wind and Truth, just very questioning of that idea. And I think, hey, maybe you guys messed up with Aiden Alcium, and maybe you've been messing up every single moment after that. Like, you didn't do any good stuff because you're trapped by your quote-unquote original sin, not from our world, but their world, which was killing God, which seems worse than like drinking from river
like
you're not supposed
gaining
to.
knowledge.
Yeah, or exactly. Eating an apple that you weren't supposed to. That seems
maybe
less
that's
bad.
why they, didn't want to eat the apple, because if you eat the apple, then you have the knowledge to be able to kill God.
That seems like why God doesn't want you to eat the apple.
Yeah.
But you should definitely still eat that apple. Let's not go too far into that particular rabbit hole. But I agree. I think the stones know all. The concept that there were bondsmiths not attached to these spren that we know now as like the big spren, but that they might have been attached to the primal forces of Roshar, that Venli and maybe other will shapers and stone wards might be our clue, our secret. I mean, Talm is a stone ward. Yes, I speak highly about Talm because he's fighting for the little guy and he's from humble beginnings himself. But what if Talm is fighting because he spoke to the stones and they were like, yo, here's the real story. And he knows that it's important for other reasons and he's motivated by other reasons.
Maybe.
I'm just saying, I think that I agree with you. The stones know a lot. And I want in the back half when we have a focus, because we haven't had a focus on a stone ward yet.
Correct.
Right? I want that to be a mystery about the stones as well.
Yeah. Yeah, that would be cool. Okay, to round out today's episode, let's leave it after one of many confrontations between Honor and Odium. They form avatars, they meet atop a hill basically and fight. Again, we're gonna soon do an episode about this particular clash, which then results in the Shattered Plains and the fourth moon and these alien stones, question mark, question mark, question mark. And after this meeting of Honor and Odium, Mishram sneaks out of the shadows, approaches Honor, and asks to make peace. Honor tells her that he would make peace if he could, but he is not able to as long as Odium fight. This is where I'm going to leave us.
Yeah.
This is the end of our chapter for today. And then we will continue forward through time in this expedition of Roshar's history.
We are just about 5,000 years ago in our timeline and our recap. There is so much more, of course. We're really just kind of like picking up on a lot of the new plot details. Much of what we've talked about has been speculated, but it's also like been kind of softly understood or confirmed. We've kind of known the general outlines, but then when it comes to the specifics of Ba-Edo Mishram, the story about a Knight Radiant and a singer who fell in love, all of that stuff, these are like when we're starting to get into the key plot points that we learn in Wind and Truth. So a lot of exciting things coming up. Also, of course, some silly things coming in April. Join us over on Patreon for at least one bonus episode of Drunk History of Roshar. And we hope that you stay tuned for several of our upcoming interview episodes with a lot of exciting guests. We know that you have enjoyed some of the ones that happened previously, and we've got more coming in the future. So it's going to be a big, fun spring and summer here on Cosmere Conversations, and we hope that you are excited to join along. Brooke, can you take us away?
Until next time, life before death,
Strength before weakness.
journey before destination.